Hey, good day to everybody that's watching. This is your brother Garfield, and this is the Brother Garfield podcast. Today, I have one of my favorite scholars in the world. I'm a huge fan of this brother. His name is Dr. Vince Bantu. He has a history of dealing with early Christianity in Africa. All right, he's a very qualified individual. His name is Dr. Vince Bantu. He has a bachelor's from Wheaton, a master's in divinity from Gordon Conwell. He also have a theology degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, a master's from there, and he has a PhD in Semitic and Egyptian languages from the Catholic University. Dr. Bantu has authored several books, including Multitude of All Peoples, exploring the multi-ethnic roots of Christianity. Dr. Bantu is an expert in the early growth of Christianity in Africa, which is one of the main things that he talks about within his conversations. And in fact, today we're going to touch on Ethiopia. We're going to try our best. We're not perfect. We're going to try our best to have a chronological conversation of the history of what we call Ethiopia. All right. But before I do that, I do want to introduce the family to some of his works. And it wouldn't be fair. I mean, I was introduced to him as far as being a writer or an editor in several books that he has out. But I'm just going to show two today. One is this one with Dr. Eric Mason was, I think, the official editor of this one. All right. This one right here deals with apologetics, urban apologetics, restoring Black dignity with the gospel. Eric Mason was the general editor. He also wrote a chapter in there, and Dr. Vince Bantu wrote a chapter and a couple other urban apologists. The next book is his recent book, The Book of Mystery of Gueorgius of Sagla. I don't know if I pronounce it properly or not. He'll correct me, of course. He's the expert. I'll allow him to mess the pronunciation up. I'm not good at pronouncing things at all. All right. But ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the gentleman. I'm a huge fan of this gentleman. For the first time, I'm interviewing him, one of the top urban apologists, Dr. Vince Bantu. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, brother Garfield. How you doing, man? Good to be here.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you. You're such a busy man. Everybody wants a piece of Dr. Vince Bantu because of what you bring to the table. Before I go into anything with the interview, I want to say that what you have done over the years as far as trying to bring information regarding Christianity, because of our natural hatred that we have for it. A lot of people call it the white man's religion, and in context, I see where they're coming from. But as far as Ethiopian traditions and us being in Africa as Africans, we have a lot to do with Christian history, which has been blanketed in schools and as far as we learning in the community, we don't learn this. So you have brought this a lot and the scholarship to back it up. And in fact, you could actually read the languages, which is very important in understanding the past. But before we go any further, I want to bring this book up, which is your latest book. And if you want to tell me a little bit about what you did as far as this book and what should we learn from reading this book?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, brother. I'm glad you that you mentioned this. This is something I'm really excited about. This is a book that I've been working on for about 4 or 5 years now. I got started on it because there's another book that I'm working on where it's going to actually be, because I love making African literature available to the world because of Eurocentrism, it gets ignored so many times. So there's so many authors. So I'm working on another project where it's actually going to be a compilation of different African and Asian Christian texts, in all in one book with the University of California Press. And so it's just going to be like snippets. So I did a chapter from this book and I'm including it in this compilation book. But when I did the chapter from this book, I thought to myself, I have to do the whole thing. I can't just do a chapter. And so I kept going and I translated the whole book. And there's so much I could say about this man, Gueorgius of Sagla. But one of the most important things, or maybe I don't know if it's the most important, but one of the first things I like to say about Gueorgius of Sagla is that he is the first documented sub-Saharan African author in the world. So just that fact alone should make us want to know about what he said. and what he wrote about, because we know that there were authors, who are known in Kemet and in Tunisia, or and Carthage and in other parts of North Africa along the Mediterranean coast. But when you get to sub-Saharan Africa, like Nubia, Kush, or or Ethiopia, Axum, and other kingdoms, the earliest one, he's not the earliest writing, because there's many much earlier than him. He lived in the 13 and 1400s, but all the writings that came from Kush or from Nubia or Ethiopia before him, the author is not attested in terms of people who wrote books and things like that. There were some songs, but the first person to write a book, he is the first one whose name we know. And he wrote his most famous book was called The Book of Mystery, and it's in my translation of it, which is the first time it's been brought into English, which is just crazy, right? Because he's the first documented sub-Saharan African author in the world. So he should be known for human history. And again, this is why Eurocentrism plays into it, because everyone's heard of Martin Luther or Thomas Aquinas or these other European theologians and philosophers, but most people have not heard of Gueorgius of Sagla, and he's the first one whose name we know. And he wrote a lot of different songs and liturgical texts, but he was a theologian and philosopher, and this is his most famous book. And up until now, it's not been available in English. And that's the other thing about the Eurocentricity, because you could go online right now on your phone and you could read Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica translated into English many times over. But Gueorgius, it hasn't been available until now. And so it's a privilege to be able to bring this work. And what he does in this book is it's a comprehensive, systematic theology. He's a Christian monk, and he was a head of a monastery in Ethiopia in the late 13 and early 1400s. And I finished this book last year, actually. So it's the 600th anniversary. He finished it in 1424 exactly. And he signed his name, and we know who wrote it. And it's what he does is he introduces all the Christian beliefs about the Trinity, about Christology, about the authority of the Bible, about Christian practices like Sabbath observance and baptism, and all of these different kind of things. So it's a comprehensive book. It's over 300 pages long. I also included the first translation into English of his biography. And in Ethiopian tradition, a biography is called a gedel. And gedel, it means struggle. And it's a story of someone's struggles in life and in faith. And so it's all combined in this one book. And so I'm really excited to bring it to the English speaking world, so that especially people who are of African descent can connect with, again, the world's first sub-Saharan African author. And also, if it's available for pre-order right now, and that's intentional because I wanted to do this with an African publisher, because I believe strongly in supporting Black-owned businesses. And so I've done books with American publishers, with predominantly white publishers. I've done books with African-American publishers, but I wanted to make sure to do this one specifically with an Ethiopian publisher. But there's challenges with that in terms of shipping. So what I'm trying to do now is actually do a push for pre-sale. So if you're interested in the book, if you want to get it, you can pre-order it at bookofmystery.org. You can check it out. And we're trying to get up to 400 pre-sales so that we can get the book shipped over, because that's part of why African publishers, most people don't work with them, because the shipping is so difficult to Europe or to North America. And so yeah, if you're able to get it, not only can you read the world's first known sub-Saharan African author and the book that he wrote, but you'll also be directly supporting African businesses directly. So yeah, again, it's Book of Mystery.
Is it Haymanot? Haymanot, is that the publishing company?
Oh, right. Well, so actually, that's my publishing company, and so you'll be giving it to me directly. But I'm working with a company called Rehoboth Publishers. It's located in Addis Ababa, and so yeah. But Haymanot Sankofa is my kind of intermediate company, and I'm collecting the pre-sales, and then we'll be ordering the printing from Rehoboth Printers in Addis Ababa.
Okay, I'm gonna definitely order mine today. And because I believe in supporting our authors and what they put out, no matter if we agree or disagree, I'm definitely going to support this project. It seems like a very interesting project. Never heard of him before today. I mean, not today, before you put it on your timeline. I never knew about him. All right. So let's get into our conversation and questions and so forth. When did you start researching modern day Ethiopia?
Yeah, I would say that I first started researching Ethiopia, not just Ethiopia, but I would say that, Kemet, Nubia, and Kush, and Ethiopia, really the Nile Valley. That was an area of interest for me going back to my first year in seminary. When I was in seminary, and my very first year, my wife and I actually took a trip to Kemet, and we studied the pyramids and a lot of the pharaonic era temples and things, but we also were focusing on early Christianity in Kemet and the Coptic church, and that was my first time hearing about it. And mind you, I had already had a degree. I was in seminary getting my master's of divinity, but I had already had a bachelor's degree in theology, and I had never heard of the Nubian church, especially when we went to Aswan and Abu Simbel, where we were in the Nubian region of Kemet, which had a lot of the Nubians, the Nubian Kemetics as well. That was a powerful experience for me to be able to learn about that history as well. And even though I didn't go there, that was also my first introduction to hearing about Ethiopian Christianity as well. So just the whole history of the Nile Valley, Northeast Africa, was my first time hearing about it. And ever since then, I just became really just fixed on wanting to learn more about ancient Africa, and especially the growth of Christianity as a Christian, or as I say, I use the Ethiopian word, as a Nazrawi, right, which just means Nazarene, and that's actually also what followers of Jesus were called in Syriac speaking world, in the Arabic speaking world. In Arabic, Nasara is the way of referring to a Christian, and so even Gueorgius, who we mentioned about, he calls himself a Nazrawi, and so it's really just a way to another way also of distancing ourselves from some of the oppressive Eurocentric expressions of Christianity that have been so unfortunately so prevalent. But yeah, as a Nazrawi, that's something that I was very interested in. Was also understanding how the Bisrat, which is an Ethiopian word for the gospel, right, the good news of Jesus Christ, of Yeshua the Messiah, how that was so prevalent in so many parts of Africa, in Egypt, in Nubia, and Ethiopia especially, and how it's even in Christian circles, how it's so unknown. A lot. I mean, Brother Garfield just shared about not knowing about Gueorgius of Sagla. I didn't know who he was. I first found out who he was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And that was after I had my PhD. I wanted to, when I took that trip, that was when I, decided to get my PhD in learning about the history of these different Christian communities. And so, I did my doctoral work in Coptic, in the Coptic language, as well as Syriac, which was another Christian language that spread all throughout the Asian continent. But it was after I finished my PhD that I did independent research and studies and did language classes on the Nubian language. So I now read and translate Nubian literature as well, Old Nubian. And then it was also after that I studied Ge'ez, and Ge'ez is the name of the ancient language of Ethiopia. And so reading literature in Coptic, in Nubian, and Ge'ez is my kind of main specialty and area, and also Arabic as well, because I want to learn more about the medieval and Middle Ages and African history, and it's important to know Arabic for that literature. But that was, and it was actually, again, after finishing my PhD, when I learned Ge'ez, that was when I first learned about Gueorgius, because he's considered, maybe the best author in the history of that language. So that was how the journey started. But I feel a kin spirit in you, Brother Garfield, of being a lifelong learner, because I still, am learning and just always learning more and more things.
Beautiful. And this question, I pose it second because I said, notice I stated modern day Ethiopia. Can you go into or elaborate for the audience on the term Ethiopia and its usage in reference to the biblical text and the context of its meaning?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. That is a great question, because a lot of people don't know that the word Ethiopia is not actually an African term, and it's not even like for example, it's not even necessarily the same thing, as Egypt, right? Where a lot of people know that the original name of Egypt is Kemet in the Egyptian language. But the Greek name or the English word Egypt comes from the Greek Aiguptos, which was really just kind of the Greek way of trying to pronounce the Kemetic name. But in the case of Ethiopia, that's a completely foreign imported word. And it's a Greek word. And Ethiopios in Greek, it means one whose face is burnt with the sun. And so basically it means a dark-skinned person. It means, so I actually am a fan of and a supporter of the idea of just translating that word as black. That word shows up in the New Testament. Now it shows up in the Old Testament in the Bible, but that's in the Septuagint. And what's really behind the Septuagint is the Hebrew. And in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, when you see the word Ethiopia come up in the Old Testament, that's really just the Septuagint translating, which is the Old Testament in Greek, and it's translating the Hebrew. And in the original Hebrew, what was behind Ethiopian was actually Cush. And Cush was a completely different country. That's what we now call Sudan, and which later became known as Nubia. But in the New Testament, then we see the word being used because it was originally written, the book of Acts was originally written in Greek. And that's where we see the term Ethiopian show up in Acts chapter 8. And it tells a story about one of the apostles encountering an Ethiopian eunuch. Now, a lot of times people think this eunuch was from Ethiopia. And even a lot of Ethiopians, and Eritreans believe that he was Ethiopian. But most scholars, even Ethiopian and Eritrean scholars, would say that he was probably not from what we now know as Ethiopia, with the modern nation of Ethiopia, or Eritrea, which are now separate nations. But he was probably from Nubia, because it says he was a eunuch of Candace or Kandake. And Kandake was the title of the queens of Meroe. Meroe was the capital of Cush in the 1st century when Luke wrote the account of Acts. And so that would mean that he was a Cushite. So why does Luke, one of the gospel writers, call him Ethiopian? Well, he was calling him black. That's just another way of calling him black, because again, Ethiopian just meant black. So I think actually the best way to translate that word in that text would be to say that he met a black eunuch, because that's really what Luke meant, because Ethiopians were black, Nubians were black. Sometimes even Greek writers would use the term Ethiopian to refer to people in India. They would travel all the way to India and say, look at all these Ethiopians, right? South Asia, or in Southern Arabia, where people are also very dark skinned. So it's not even an ethnic term. It's not a tribal or a linguistic term. It's really a racial term, or we could say proto-racial, like Benjamin Isaac uses when we talk about the concept of race in antiquity, that it was an all-encompassing term that regardless of ethnicity, it could be Nubian, Ethiopian, Indian, whatever. It's just a way of Greek-speaking people saying a dark-skinned person, right? Once you get south of Egypt, that was in their mindset. South of the First Cataract was the land of the black people, or the Ethiopians. So that's how that term got used. And the irony is that what we now call Ethiopia, the country now known as Ethiopia, was not called Ethiopia by those people. Now, again, it was called Ethiopia by people outside of that world in the Roman Empire and in the Greek-speaking world. But people who actually lived there, they called it Axum. It went by a few different names. Axum was the capital city. By the 1st century, Axum was the capital city. So sometimes it gets called the Axumite Empire or the Kingdom of Axum. But that's really just the capital city, and it actually spread all the way to the Red Sea in the city of Adulis, and all throughout what's now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Tigray province. But it was also, in a broader sense, it was also called Habesha. Habesha was another name that was used in Ge'ez inscriptions, and then another name that gets used is actually called Agazi. And so Agazi is another term that refers to the whole region or the whole kingdom. They would call it the region of Agazi. And it's interesting, the name Agazi is actually etymologically related to the name Ge'ez, which is the classical ancient language of Ethiopia. And it's actually related to the word for freedom or free people. So again, they didn't call themselves Ethiopians, which just meant black people, but they actually used that term. But eventually they did start to use that term because they knew that's how Greek people referred to them. So it's kind of like you could relate it to those of us in the diaspora, African people in the diaspora in the Americas, that we take on these terms like black or Negro, or even other terms, right? That lump various black people together, but that wasn't used by our ancestors in West Africa or other things like that. And so that's a little bit similar, because then going even in the late antique period, Ethiopians, they still use their own name, but they started to use it, especially if they wrote in Greek inscriptions, because they would have tablets written in Ge'ez and in Greek on the other side. And sometimes on the Greek side, it would say it would use the Greek term Ethiopian, and Nubian inscriptions would do the same thing. They started to use that term to describe themselves because they knew they were black and they still had that concept. And then by the medieval period, you started to see the term Ethiopia being used for that kingdom as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said. I couldn't have said it better, boy. I couldn't have said it better. And that's thanks for the clarity. So let's try to do this in chronological order. We're talking about King Solomon time period now. We know the story of Queen of Sheba meeting Solomon, approximately 10th century BC. Did the area we call Ethiopia today have a specific name for that geographic location? 10th century BC.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I want to, again, like tread carefully because I think there are, two ways of answering this question. And I already kind of touched on it a little bit when I was talking about, even the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. And so I want to be respectful, but also be clear that there are different ways of approaching these questions. There's the Ethiopian and Eritrean tradition, and then there are other perspectives, especially in academic circles, that might be, and which even include a lot of Ethiopians and Eritreans that might be different than the tradition. As I mentioned, the Ethiopian eunuch, so-called Ethiopian, right, who's most likely Nubian, but in the tradition, that the Ethiopian and Eritrean tradition states that eunuch was from Ethiopia, from Axum. And so while I respect the tradition and I don't want to be disrespectful in any way to the tradition, I also respectfully disagree that eunuch was actually from, what we now call Ethiopia. A similar way we have to approach the story of the Queen of Sheba, right? So there's the story of the Queen of Sheba is extremely important for Ethiopian and Eritrean tradition. But it's also one that I respectfully don't feel is actually speaking to the actual situation in Ethiopia. So we know that King Solomon would have lived in the 10th century BC, as you said, and the Queen of Sheba visited him, as is reported in the book of First Kings in the Tanakh. And even the location of Sheba is debated, right? Because again, first of all, you have to accept the fact that Sheba is a reference to Ethiopia, which I don't think it is. But I think that it's another way of spelling the kingdom of Saba, Saba, and the kingdom of Saba was located in southern Arabia. And even Jesus refers to that story in Matthew when he talks about the queen of the south. And so Sheba or Saba was located south of Jerusalem. And, to be fair, both Ethiopia and Arabia are south of Jerusalem, and they're right across the Red Sea from each other. And they also have an intertwined history, which I'm sure we'll get into. But the kingdom of Saba is older than the kingdom of Ethiopia. But not only that, but the kingdom of what was in Ethiopia, as I just mentioned, was called the kingdom of Axum or Agazi or Habesha. That started in the 1st century, between the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. But when you go back to the 10th century BC, actually, there may not have really been an urbanized, developed city-state in what's now known as Ethiopia. Now, there was a kingdom of Saba, of Sheba at that time when it was really getting going. But it wasn't probably until the 9th millennium or BC where you started to have, the 9th century, where you started to have a large kind of city-state in Ethiopia. And that was a kingdom called Damut. And so the kingdom of Damut would have gotten started around the 9th century BCE, and that's when a lot of their temples, like the capital city of Yeha and the really large temple and also palace complex, are dated to around that time period. And so the other thing about that, though, is that from that time forward up through the whole first millennium BCE, there's really no sign of monotheism in the kingdom of Damut. But it's actually pretty clear that they practiced a traditional religion that was actually very much related to the religion of Saba or Sabaean. In fact, a lot of the inscriptions found in Damut were written in the Sabaean language. So there was a strong cultural intermixing going on in South Arabia and in the kingdom of Damut. But if the story is true, then you would think that there would not be these polytheistic or these sun and moon god worshiping sacrifices and altars that you find in the temple complex at Yeha, where they were worshiping the moon god Amaka, which was also worshipped in the Sabaean culture. Because in the story in the tradition, the story is that the Queen of Sheba met with Solomon and that he actually tricked her into sleeping with him. And then she became pregnant with a son who was a Hebrew and an Ethiopian, and his name was Menelik. And he ended up through a kind of a miraculous story and situation, the Ark of the Covenant came with him to Ethiopia and stayed there. And again, the tradition is that it's still there today, and in the city of Axum, which was the capital city. But again, that wasn't really till the 1st century. That wouldn't have been the capital city. Axum would have been the capital of Ethiopia back in the 10th century BCE. And in fact, even Dumut, even Yeha wasn't even founded at that point necessarily. And so it again, with respect to the tradition, it's not very likely that there was a king who was acknowledged the Hebrew God Yahweh and introduced monotheistic worship and practice in Dumut and then later in Agazi. And I know we'll get to this later, but it likely wasn't until the 4th century of the Common Era, CE or AD, that Christianity and monotheism was introduced to Ethiopia.
All right, beautiful, 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 beautiful. You said a lot. Let's get to the next question now. So we get to where we're at the 10th century. You talked about Saba. You said it's about the 9th century BC. Okay. We get to the 8th century BC. We find a kingdom called Demet that he was talking about. We find kings and queens leading. What was it like then? I think you actually answered some of it with the previous answer, but get into that a little bit and we go to the next question.
Yeah. So again, during the time of Demut, it's a little difficult to know. There's mainly archaeological evidence, and there's also some inscriptional evidence. But as you mentioned, as I touched on already, it's pretty clear that during the time of Demut, which again was the 1st millennium BCE, that they were definitely engaged in worship of a variety of gods. They worshiped Shams, which was the sun god, and they also worshiped, and there would also be Greek equivalents because, later on in the Common Era, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, there's also Greek inscriptions which show that they would have been worshiping Greek gods as well as Sabaean gods as well, and then also incorporated and grew a local tradition in the kingdom of Demut. And it was ruled by kings close to the temple. Many people think that the capital of Demut would have been Yeha because of the size of the foundation of the ruins there. There's a massive temple, and in that temple there is very clear evidence of the worship of sun and moon god. There's sacrificial altars. There's no indication whatsoever of them worshiping a monotheistic god or the Hebrew god Yahweh. And also there's a very massive palace complex. So it was a highly developed society and civilization. There are other ancient sites, though, that are also just as old, if not older, than Yeha, especially in what's now known as Eritrea. And some of the main sites there are the sites of Senafe, as well as Kohaito. And Kohaito and Senafe also have, and as well as Metara. Metara also has one of the oldest Ge'ez inscription, which comes from the 1st century. So that shows the transition from what we now call Ethiopia, when it transitioned from the Demut period, and then mainly speaking and using Sabaean language, and then transitioning into Ge'ez, which is a language that developed uniquely in the Horn of Africa. And it also, but again, what we can see is that it was a large organized city state, that they were involved in the Red Sea trade. One of the first mentions of the kingdom of Demut and of this region was actually from the anonymous text, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And that's a Greek text, where a travel log, where it basically is instructions on how to travel through the Mediterranean and Red Sea and Indian Oceans. And it refers to this kingdom that was already well established in the 1st century of the Common Era. And Pliny the Elder and other 1st century authors reference this. So it was a very a very active kingdom, and especially at the city of Adulis, which is right on the Red Sea, that's in modern day Eritrea. But in the ancient times, these would have been one kingdom, and so it had access to Red Sea. So they were trading with Sabaeans across the Red Sea, other places in Arabia, even the Indian Ocean, and also the Roman Empire as well, which is where their interest in starting to incorporate Greek into their inscriptions would have come from.
All right. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right. You touched on, for the next question, I was going to ask you about the 4th century BC. We find archaeology, the Temple of Yeha. Can you just repeat what you said about the god that they worshipped at the time and who they were worshiping at the Temple of Yeha?
Yeah. So they in the temple of Yeha, there are it's a massive temple. There's walls left and also the floor. The roof isn't there, but there's sacrificial altars towards the back of the temple where they would have sacrificed animals, and there are inscriptions, and also there's writings. If you go there, there's a museum right next door that houses a lot of the inscriptions that were on the walls to keep them safe. And interestingly, there's actually a Makala game board, a stone game board that goes back 3,000 years, that's actually just sitting right outside, and there's brothers playing Makala right outside the temple, which is really cool. So it shows some of the everyday life as well in the temple. But yeah, they would have worshipped the sun god Shams, which was also a Sabaean god. So that we see that during the Demut period, there was a lot of strong influence from the Sabaean culture, which is different than in the Ge'ez period, where there's actually seems to be more and especially during the Christian period, which I find interesting that it was actually during the Christian period where Ethiopia found a lot of its own unique cultural footing. But yeah, they would have worshipped Shams, the sun god, or Amacha, the moon god, which were also worshipped in Sabaean culture as well. And you see this transitioning into the kingdom of Axum when Ge'ez begins to be used as the imperial language. That you also see these same gods being worshipped during the Axumite period, up until the 4th century, when the kingdom converted to Christianity. That the sun and moon gods were continuing to be worshipped, but also many of the Greek gods were beginning to be incorporated as well. And this is very common in the ancient world, that people would worship other gods, like Egyptian and Canaanite and Sabaean and traditional Ethiopian, Nubian, Roman and Greek. Oftentimes in the same temple, you could worship. Even sometimes different gods were seen as like almost a counterpart of one another. Like this culture has a sun god, and so does this culture. So you call it Ra, and we call it Serapis or whatever. And so these and then Babylonian and Assyrian as well. So a lot of times these different gods would be even worshipped interchangeably, and we see that continuing on from the Demut period into the Axumite period.
All right, so we get to the 2nd century BC to like around the 1st century. We see that we have the emerging Axumite Empire, which expanded the borders of the previous empire, including parts of southern Arabia. At one point, it was considered the 4th largest empire in the world. What can you tell us about this Axumite Empire and their origins? And I'm going to show, while you're talking, I'm trying to show images of the Temple of Yeha, the Demid Empire, Saba, so people have an idea of what you're speaking about. All right, go ahead, my brother.
Okay. Yeah. So it's actually a little bit difficult to know how or what were the circumstances that led to the decline of Demut, and then also the rise of Axum. There's not a lot of, there was already, even during the Demut period, where Yeha was and also not just, again, Kohaito and Senafe were also very big centers, and they were a little bit closer to the Red Sea. So, that shows us that as Axum developed, Axum is geographically further west and further even into the highlands of Ethiopia than Yeha, Kohaito, or Senafe, or Metada, or Adulis which were much closer to the Red Sea. But Axum is going a little bit further, so it's showing the migration and the spread of humans across the Horn of Africa, away from the Red Sea, and going up into the highlands of Eritrea and Ethiopia. And but there's not a whole lot of known. I mentioned a minute ago the Hawulti Monument, Hawulti. The Hawulti Monument is located in modern-day Eritrea, and it's the oldest inscription of Ge'ez, and also the earliest attestation of the Axumite Empire. And so, and also the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea also references the Axumite Empire. And but it's not really clear as to what led to the decline of Demut and to the rise of Axum, the kingdom of Axum, or again Agazi. But we do know that there was already people living through archaeology, that there were already people living in what is now Axum even during the Demut period. But then around the first, based on that Hawulti inscription, it was probably around the 1st century BCE that the new empire in that region started to be known as Axum. And then also in the city of Axum, we start to see it in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. We start to also get a lot of coin evidence. So many of the kings of Axum are known through their coins that tell us some of their names, and also some of the give us through the numismatic or through the coin evidence and archaeology can tell us about when they reigned. And so we know there was a very active monarchy. And then we also in the capital city of Axum, that's when we get these magnificent stela, or these pillars, which are actually even taller than the stela that are in Kemet in Egypt. And this became really the center. These stela were for royal burials, and not only the pillars above ground, but there's also a lot of massive underground tombs for the kings of Axum, and preserving their bodies, and also for worshiping and honoring the gods and also the ancestors was really important during that Axumite period.
All right, so last question on this small period before we get to the 4th century. Early on, are these people worshiping, 2 questions in one, are they worshiping the God of the Bible as we know? And what was their culture like regarding belief systems, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, I got to answer it 2 ways, because I want to show respect to the tradition, and also just to be so that we're fully informed that so people don't get confused when you hear conflicting answers. So again, according to Ethiopian and Eritrean church tradition, Ethiopia would have been monotheistic at this point, through the 1st century BCE. And again, according to the tradition, so they would have been monotheistic. They would have been introduced to the God of Israel, Yahweh, and they would have not been practicing polytheism. But archaeology shows us that they likely were practicing polytheism during the time of Demut and even the earliest centuries of Axum. But according to the tradition, monotheism got introduced during the time of the Queen of Sheba in the 10th century BCE. That Christianity, the message of Christianity, was introduced through the Ethiopian eunuch in the 1st century CE. And then in the 4th century, and we'll talk more about this, but in the 4th century, when some Christian missionaries came in, that was when the Christian sacraments were introduced. So, Eucharist and baptism, and also when there was a priesthood and an organized church, right? So that's the chronology of events. So according to the tradition, during this time period, during the earliest centuries of Axum, in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century of the Common Era, they would have been Christians, but without an organized church structure. Now, my opinion, and a lot of other scholars' opinion, is that they were probably not. It certainly was not a very dominant faith. That Christianity was not a dominant faith, at least as far as what the archaeological and the inscriptional evidence shows us. But they were probably still largely practicing their traditional, Sabaean, their Ethio-Sabaean religions of worshiping the sun and moon gods. And in fact, and I know we're about to go to this, but in fact, a nice bridge into that is King Ezana himself, who is the first Christian emperor, allegedly. And even in his own coins in his name, there are sun and moon crescents on his coins, which shows that he was still worshiping or involved or supporting the worship of the original sun and moon gods. And on his inscriptions that were written, there are 4 different tablets that were commissioned by him, and it's written in 3 different languages, in Ge'ez and Sabaean and Greek. And on the in the Ge'ez and the Sabaean side, he actually gives praise and glory to Ares, and also into Sabaean and Greek gods. But then on the Greek side, he gives glory to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's showing that even in the 4th century, when Ethiopia was transitioning to becoming a Christian kingdom, there was, even at that point, there was still a lot of traditional practices. And again, there are temples and other inscriptions that the Huwulti monument also has the same traditional. Again, people use the word pagan. I don't like to use that word because I want to be respectful of traditional religions. But there were traditional religious symbols that showed their polytheistic beliefs even at that time. So I would argue they were still practicing polytheism even up until the 4th century. But the last thing I'll say about that, they're according not only to Ethiopian tradition, but also even from texts from the ancient period, from Ethiopian texts, it says that there were Christians already present in Ethiopia even before the official Christianization. Which now those witnesses come from much later. They come from like the 14th and 15th century, so 1,000 years after the Christianity became the national religion. But it's not improbable to think that even though it wasn't the dominant faith, there still would have been some Christians present even in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries in Axum. It's very likely. Oh, I'm sorry, brother. I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, off script for 1 second, because you just said something very important, and if something hit me, I gotta come at the scholar with it, right? Listen, if the tradition is you have a fermentous tradition, you have a different traditions, you have traditions that you're trying to respect. I'm saying logically, right? And this is pure speculation, but it makes a lot of sense. If fermenters or anyone came there with Christianity, they didn't just teach one person. It wouldn't be one person. It would be a group of people, and a group of people attracted to it to make a move. And so it can't be just King Ezana as this lone wolf in all of this gigantic region. It makes no sense. So knowing how Christianity was and how people had missionary movements, there are movements we've heard of that's recorded, and there are movements that we've not heard of. So I would say Christianity more than likely was present there. More than one person was converted to Christianity. All right. So moving on, let's get right into King Ezana and the steles. And I'm going to show a couple on the screen while you speak about King Ezana. And the question is, we get to the 4th century and we hear different traditions of Axumite King Ezana regarding Christianity, etc. Can you elaborate on these traditions as far as the conversion and Christianity? Go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for the listeners that maybe this is their first time hearing about it, this is another name that we absolutely have to know in African history and world history. Ezana, King Ezana, was the king of Ethiopia during the the early and mid 300s, and he is known as being the king who Christianized Ethiopia, who brought Christianity into the national as the national imperial religion. And in fact, that's what we're looking at right now is actually his stela. Notice the designs on the stela actually, because that's actually I love, because as a Black Nazari Christian who is both proud of my Christian faith but also my African ancestry, I love the fact that later, as Ethiopia becomes almost completely Christian empire throughout the rest of history, how they actually use that same architectural design in the design of churches. And so it shows how, African culture, even pre-Christian African culture, still was utilized even in the promotion of Christian tradition in Ethiopia, and how the Ethiopian Christianity really is an indigenous African religion. But the top of those is actually meant to also evoke the sun god of Shams, right? And so, and as well as the moon, the inside crescent is for the moon gods, Amaka. So again, it's showing that even on his grave, that he still has these indigenous, polytheistic symbols. And fun fact, well, not fun fact, but interesting fact, messed up fact, is actually when the Italians came in and occupied Ethiopia during World War II, they actually stole this stela and brought it to Italy, and they only brought it back to Ethiopia about 20 years ago, I think around the 2000s, and that's why it has the scaffolding up. But even though the Italians tried to occupy Ethiopia, this is a fun fact, is that for those that may not have known that, did you know that Ethiopia is the only Black nation in the world that has never been colonized by a European power? And so some people might say, no, there's Liberia also. I think there's a complicated history when it comes to Liberia, and one would argue that the U.S.'s intervention could be very much considered colonialism. But no, Ethiopia is the only country that has never been colonized. The Italians tried to occupy it, but also the Ethiopians actually defeated them at the Battle of Adwa in 1890s and pushed them out. And so again, this is a very proud and very really important fact to know about Ethiopia as well. But going back to the stela, yeah, these are there were as you see, there's all throughout the stela field. This is in the capital city of Axum. This is what it still looks like today, and there were different pillars for different kings and queens and dignitaries and nobles. And outside of Axum, there's actually a palace that the tradition holds was the Queen of Sheba's palace, but it was probably more likely during this time period, like the first few centuries of the common area for a monarch. And these were but anyway, there's also found here several inscriptions that King Ezana commissioned that, as I mentioned, were written in 3 different languages, in Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek, because they wanted it was a multicultural, multi-ethnic place. It was connected to the rest of the world through Red Sea trade and Indian Ocean trade and in the Mediterranean. So they wanted to be available. Now, as I mentioned, Ezana's own inscriptions have him giving thanks to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and talking about Jesus, but then also giving praise to Ares and to Almaka and Sham. So I would go even further than what you said, Brother Garb. I agree with what you said that, we'll mention the history of how Christianity came in, but it couldn't be just that Ezana was the only king and that he imposed Christianity. I actually would go even further and say, I'm not really sure that Ezana himself was a Christian. I think maybe he, kind of like Emperor Constantine did in the Roman Empire, that maybe he was just kind of embracing Christianity as one of several religions, and he wanted to just kind of support them all without actually himself being devoted exclusively to one, because we know that throughout Christian history, Nazari's Christians are Christians only, right? And that's actually a way that they're different than other traditional religions, because as I just mentioned, in traditional Greek, Kemetic, Ethiopian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Nubian religion, you don't have to only worship one God. You can worship all kinds of gods. You can bring, and they could be from other countries. As you learn about other gods, you can worship all of them. But Nazari's are unique in the sense that they say, no, we only worship Jesus. So for Ezana to have these different references to different gods, to me, that indicates, and also on his stela, still, having the traditional polytheistic motifs, I would argue that he probably was not necessarily a Christian, but he just became familiar with Christianity, and he probably just was supporting it among other religions as a way, maybe even to connect with other kingdoms that were largely Christian, like in Arabia or India had a lot of Christians, and in the Eastern Roman Empire or in Syria as well. But we definitely know that there were Christians throughout Ethiopia, because the Christian side of his inscriptions show a clear familiarity with Christian belief and also with the Bible. So there were definitely Christians there that would have supported, but the story goes, and several Roman sources tell us this, as well as later Ethiopian sources. The story goes that there was a man from Syria named Frumentius, or from the Levant. He was from Tyre, which is modern day Lebanon. And he came, he was actually the son of a merchant, and him and his brother were children at the time, and their uncle was a merchant traveling through the Red Sea and shipwrecked, and then he was killed by pirates, and then the boys, Frumentius and Odysseus, were taken to the imperial court during the time of Eliamida, the king of Axum, who was Ezana's father. And they were raised as slaves. Frumentius and Odysseus were raised as slaves in the imperial court, and then they began, as they grew up, they started to share Christianity with many people, especially in the royal household, and they actually grew up with Ezana. And then when they came of age, and it was time for Ezana to become king, he allowed them to become free. And even by the time they left, they had converted many Ethiopians to Christianity, including Ezana and his mother. And then they went back. Meropius went back to Tyre, where he was from, but Frumentius actually went to Kemet. He went to Egypt, and he actually spoke with Athanasius, who was the Pope or the Patriarch of Egypt at that time in the 300s. And he asked him for permission to go back to Ethiopia and to be the first bishop of Ethiopia. And Athanasius allowed him to do that. And then Frumentius became the first Abuna, and he's still called the first Abuna, the father of light, in Ethiopia. And the current patriarch of Ethiopia traces their episcopal lineage all the way back to Frumentius. Now there are later. Now that story is told by a Roman historian, Rufinus, in the 4th century, and then it was repeated by other Roman historians as well. But there are later Ethiopian traditions, and in fact, going back to what you mentioned, Brother Garfield, my new book, Gueorgius of Sagla in the 1400s. Now that's much later than than the time of Rufinus, who was closer to the time period, but it's also in Ge'ez and it's in Ethiopia, which could speak to an oral tradition that was passed down and other written traditions that Gueorgius was privy to that Rufinus was not, because he had never even been to Ethiopia. And so in the Ethiopian account, it's mostly similar, but there's some differences. Like, for example, Frumentius and his brother were not raised as slaves. They were not enslaved, and their father was not killed, but they decided to live in Ethiopia. And as I mentioned earlier, in the Ethiopian account, it mentions that there were already Christians present even before Frumentius got there. So it wasn't that he brought Christianity, but he helped to fortify it and to continue to grow it. But otherwise, the stories are mostly the same. And from that point on, from the time of King Ezana going forward, Christianity was the dominant faith in Ethiopia. And after the time of Ezana, you would not really see any kings like Ezana did, like having inscriptions or having kind of invoking the names of the traditional Sabaean or Greek gods.
Good, beautiful, beautiful. When do we actually see an Ethiopian Bible? Where does that come from?
So the Ethiopian Bible comes a little bit after the time of King Ezana. So again, this is a part of the Ethiopian tradition that some people doubt, and it could have happened, it could not have happened. But in the Ethiopian and Eritrean church tradition, there was a group of missionaries and monks called the Nine Saints. So monasticism, living together as ascetics or monks, that still is a huge part of Ethiopian and Eritrean history. And in fact, the monasteries even today are some of the best cultivators and protectors of African history, of text, literature, artwork. In fact, the book that I just translated, I was able to go to Gueorgius's monastery called Debradamo, and they still are retaining many of I got to see one of the original manuscripts written in 600 years ago in the 1400s. And so these are powerful examples and cultivators and preservers of African history even today, but they're also very ancient. And so the tradition goes that after the time of King Ezana, that monasticism was introduced in Ethiopia. Monasticism was very popular in Egypt, in Kemet. It was in Syria, in the Persian Empire, where there were many Christians. It was very popular. And even later, it eventually became very popular in Europe as well, which European monk, that was how Christianity actually spread in Europe, in Ireland, Scotland, and England, and other places. It was the same thing, monastic communities in the 500s and 600s and 700s later. And they got a lot of their practices from Kemet. And places like Ethiopia as well, which they actually got monasticism first. But there were 9 Syrian missionaries or saints, so they're called the 9 Saints, and they came to Ethiopia somewhere. The tradition says somewhere in the 6th century. Now that could very well be the case, because again, the tradition holds that these 9 saints came to Ethiopia and they introduced monasticism. And they also helped to translate the Bible into Ge'ez, which is the classical language of Ethiopia. And so you would have books like these ones here that would have and you'd have monks like the brother in the picture holding it, who will say that these books come from the 6th century. Now, the radiocarbon dating on these earliest Bible manuscripts actually date to about that time period. So both, this is where science, Western science and Ethiopian tradition agree that the earliest books ever written in the Ge'ez language was the Bible. Now, again, as I mentioned, there were inscriptions already on stone that Ezana had made, and even in the 1st century, remember the Hawuti manuscript. But the first book on paper, on papyrus and leather and skin paper, was the Bible. Now, there's one particular saint who is credited with translating the Bible, and he was one of the saints whose name was Garima, and so he's called Abba Garima, and so that's why the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called the Garima Gospels, and he's credited with having translated them into Ge'ez. But several of the 9 saints all participated, and in fact, even today in Ethiopia and in Eritrea, there are monasteries named after each one of these 9 saints, that they founded monasteries and that they lived and died the rest of their life in Ethiopia. Matter of fact, going back to the Temple of Yeha, interesting. I love it when I see African Christians embracing their African identity. And because we know Christianity is not a white man's religion, it's not a European religion, but it has a long history in Africa. But fun fact is that going back to the temple of Yeha, if you remember, that's one of the oldest temples in Ethiopia, and it worshipped the polytheistic gods. But when Ethiopia became Christian, the tradition is that one of the other 9 saints went to Yeha, and he actually lived there and started a church. And there's still a church right next door. The temple that Brother Garfield showed us is the ancient remains of the temple going back to the 9th century BCE. But right next door, there's a church. And interestingly, the church actually took some of the sculptures of animals off of the so-called pagan temple, and they put it on the church. And so it's still on the church to this day. And that one of the 9, I think his name was Abba Afse. And so that's still the church of Abba Afse. And that's on one side of the temple. On the other side of the temple is actually a sacred space for Ethiopian Christians and Eritrean Christians, where Abba Afse literally died. And he was in the wall of the temple, not the church, but the temple. And he was praying there. And even to this day, there's a shrine on the wall. There's a hole in the wall of the temple, and there's a shrine there even today where Ethiopian and Eritrean Christians go to pray and remember Abba Afse and his gospel work. And so I just thought that was really cool that they actually were using material from this temple, and then they were using it to build their church. But yeah, the 9 saints, they spread all throughout Ethiopia, and they spread monasticism and helped to translate the Bible into Ge'ez. And they would have likely, most scholars think that they probably translated the Bible from the Greek, certainly the Greek New Testament, but then also even the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint. But there's some debate about that because if the 9 saints were from Roman Syria, they would have been familiar with Greek, but they also would have been familiar with Syriac. And Syriac is, as I mentioned, that's another very important language. It's a dialect of Aramaic, and it's one of the first languages that the Bible was translated into. It's called the Peshitta. So some people think maybe they could have used the Peshitta, the Syriac version, but most people think it was the Greek. But we do know, though, that scholars in Ethiopia were aware of various translations. So they would have read the Greek, the Hebrew, the first, like Garima Gospels, the first Bibles were probably translated from the Greek, but scholars, as the centuries went on, were very much familiar with the Syriac, the Peshitta. They were familiar with the Coptic from Kemet, from the Greek, from the Hebrew. And in fact, there are Bible translations that come from later times that have different languages next to each other, like the same Bible chapter, but in like Ge'ez, in Coptic, in Greek, in Hebrew, in Syriac. So they were very familiar with looking at the different versions.
Importantly, we're going to talk about Second Esdras in like the next 2 or 3 questions. But your Syriac point is important because I do believe the Ethiopian version comes from the Syriac because of what it says at the beginning of chapter 3 regarding who wrote it, Selassie. And I think that's from the Syriac version of Second Esdras. So that may be possible. They could have gotten some from Greek because they see the Greek loan words into the Ge'ez that shows evidence of the Greek, but other parts of it, maybe the Ethiopians wanted to just incorporate everything and be their own people, you know what I'm saying, and do their own thing. So this leads to I often get confused about Ethiopian Bible traditions. What does the oldest illustrated Bible mean? We always hear that Ethiopia got the oldest Bible. Ethiopia got the oldest Bible. So what does it mean to be the oldest illustrated Bible?
Yeah, that's a great point because the picture you had up, it actually just showed. This. I think if I recall correctly, I think that this may be an illustration of one of the gospel, right? Maybe Luke or Mark. Kind of a depiction of what they would have maybe imagined them to look like, the writers of the gospel, and many of these Garima Gospels, they had various illuminated pages, right? Illuminated in the sense of they had pictures or drawings in them. And yeah, exactly to your point, these Garima Gospels are the earliest documented because they're from the late 5th and certainly no later than the 6th century. And these are the earliest illuminated Bible books in human history because illuminated manuscripts, and especially in Christian traditions around the world, having Bibles or having other sacred holy books that had pictures in them was a very, very common thing all across the Christian world, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, in other parts of Africa. But the first ones, the earliest dated ones, come from Ethiopia. And so again, that shows the importance of Ethiopia for influencing Christianity and Christian practices all over the world.
Okay. Why does the Ethiopian Bible have so many books?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so first of all, for the listeners that may not be familiar, that might be a new fact for y'all, that as Brother Garfield said, the Ethiopian Bible, out of all the Christian traditions in the world, has the most amount of books. It has 81 books. And actually, that's even, just the 81 is just considered what's called sometimes the shorter canon. But there's actually an even longer canon. So it actually has even more than that, than 81. But the 81 books, they have a kind of a special status, if you will. But I think the short answer to why does the Ethiopian Bible have so many books, I think is for two reasons. Number one, or actually we could even say three reasons. First of all, for those that are familiar with Protestants tend to have the shortest Bible canon. They have 66 books. But Roman Catholics and other Orthodox communities, Eastern Orthodox, Greek, Coptic, and others, they have longer Bible canons because they include books that are called the Deuterocanon. Some people call them Apocrypha, but again, just trying to be respectful of people's traditions. Most like Catholic and Orthodox Christians, which Ethiopian are considered Orthodox, they are Orthodox Christians. They don't really like the term apocryphal. The word apocryphal in Greek means hidden, and it kind of gives this sense that these other books were hidden, and that's not true. That's not historically true at all. These books have never been hidden. They've always been available. The author that I just translated from the 1400s, he quotes from the Deuterocanonical books like a lot. So they were not hidden at any point in history. They've always been available. But it might be a little bit of that Protestant bias against those books. So they like to call them Deuterocanonical books, and Deuterocanonical just means second canon. And it also, even among Catholic and Orthodox, sometimes there is somewhat of almost a secondary status that they are considered canonical, but they're not on the same level because they're not considered in the Jewish canon, right? So in the Hebrew community, those Deuterocanonical books are not considered canonical because they're not considered to be part of when the period of prophecy was going on, like in the Masoretic, in the Hebrew text. But there were these extra books. If you're familiar with the Bible, there's a historical gap in the Bible between the Old and New Testaments. The book of Malachi is around the 5th century BCE. Then you get Matthew or Mark. People think Mark was written first, but either way, that's the 1st century. So there's a gap of about 500 years in between the Old and New Testament. These Deuterocanonical books, they are set during that time period. They take place, most of them are during that time period when the Hebrews return from exile, and then when they are undergoing Greek colonization and oppression, and then it's telling the stories about the Maccabean revolt and different things like that lead up until the Roman colonization of the Hebrew people. And a lot of different Catholic or Orthodox people would see those books as canonical, even if they're not at quite the same level as the Tanakh or the New Testament canon. So that's one reason why they have more books, just like other Catholic and Orthodox Christians have more books. And the teachings in these books don't really go against any of the overall Christian doctrines that you would find in the 66 books that Protestants recognize as canonical. But I would say a second reason is because some of the books that are in the Ethiopian canon only survive in Ge'ez. Some examples, probably the two of the most famous books. There's a lot of books that are in the Ethiopian canon that are not in others, but two of the most famous ones that have got a lot of attention is the Book of Enoch, because it has a lot of content that's very unique. It tells about the story of the Enoch mentioned in Genesis 5, who was taken up to heaven. But the Book of Enoch fleshes out a lot of that information in more detail and has a lot of information about angels or watchers and the fallen angels that had Nephilim with human beings and all these different visions that Enoch had. And then also the Book of Jubilees is another book that only survives in Ge'ez and is set during the time of Genesis, is alleged to be more kind of Torah observant laws, especially around the year of Jubilees and other rituals that were also said to be given by Moses. Now, even the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches, they don't hold that these books were originally written in Ge'ez. They were and scholars would agree, they were most likely written in Hebrew or Aramaic and then later translated into Ge'ez. And some of the Deuterocanonic books may be originally written in Greek during the Hellenistic period. But like I said, even though they were originally written in those languages, and there are other shorter manuscripts that were found in Qumran and the Dead Sea community. So they were not only in Ethiopia, but the only complete version survived in Ge'ez. Why that is, I don't really know if we can know. But that also would make sense as to why, if they only fully survive in Ge'ez, why the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches have retained them as part of their canon. And in fact, Gueorgius of Sagla, who I translated, who we mentioned earlier, he quotes from Jubilees extensively, and Enoch, and all of the other books, as well as the 66 books. And then the third reason, and final reason I would give as to why that is, why we think we can't, necessarily fully know, but why I would say the Ethiopian canon is so much longer is that I think in general, the Ethiopian and Eritrean, we always remember when we talk about the Ethiopian tradition, we really got to remember Eritrea, because it's the similar tradition, but now it's in two nations. And so we're really talking about not just Ethiopia, but Eritrea as well. And they have their Eritrean Orthodox Church as well, but has the same lineage. But the Eritrean and Ethiopian Christian traditions, I would say, and many people have said, are a lot more inclusive than other Christian traditions. And they include other books as well, like Clement and Josephon and Maccabean, and various other books that are not found in other canons, as well as even church tradition, like Gueorgius of Sagla, the Book of Mystery that I have translated. We talked about that's also included, not in the canon, but it's included in some of the top theological books, and even in the sense that Ethiopian Christianity and Eritrean Christianity are much more inclusive of Jewish practices. There are many Jewish people in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Sometimes they're called the Falasha. Some communities are called Beta Israel or House of Israel, and some of them are called Hymenot, that are kind of messianic Jewish Christian Ethiopian and Eritreans. But there's a long history of Jewish communities in Ethiopia and Eritrea, both in the countries as well as in Israel and in the diaspora. And but even in the Nazari communities, there is a strong emphasis on Judaism and Jewish practices that you don't see in other Christian communities. Like, for example, every Ethiopian church has a Mukdas, or a Holy of Holies, which is a throwback to the temple in the Jewish in the First Testament period. And so there's a lot of Jewish influence in Ethiopian and Eritrean Christianity that you don't see in other communities. And that's just another example of how these traditions are more inclusive and embracing of other traditions and even other literature that is in line and in keeping with Christian doctrine.
Okay. Let's briefly get into Second Esdras. Is Second Esdras, also known as Fourth Esdras, included in the Ethiopian canon? And if yes, when was it added?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that we can fully know or say when exactly, not only Second Esdras or Fourth Esdras, another name it's also known by, and that's actually the name that Gueorgius calls it when he quotes from it, is Ezra Sutiel. Because that's like an Ethiopic way of saying Shealtiel, who was one of the rulers in ancient Israel during the time of Ezra the scribe. But yeah, Ezra or Second Esdras or Fourth Esdras is another one of the the books that was kind of an apocalyptic book that shows different visions and things like that were added later. But and it's also known as Ezra Sutiel, and that book is it's difficult to say exactly when it was added, because again, there's not, honestly, even in other Christian canons, sometimes people say the Council of Nicaea, but there was already a sense of a canon even for Christians in the Roman Empire or in the Persian Empire. And so I don't know if really for any canon that there was one particular moment. I mean, certainly in Western European church history, when Protestantism came around, then the Council of Trent reaffirmed the canon, and then different reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, they had their ideas of what the canon was. But I don't know if there's any one point that we can point to in history and say that's the moment that it was decided. But there are certainly moments for different communities when they begin to reaffirm. But I don't know if we can point to one point, because some of the earliest authors, like Gueorgius, he quotes from Ezra Sutiel all over his book. But there's, he's writing in such a way that it's clear that in his context, Ezra Sutiel was already considered canon, just like Jubilees and Enoch and others were. But he doesn't point to a moment when that happened. And so it was just already being circulated and embraced. So there could have been like a council or a meeting, but we don't know when that was. All we can see is that from the earliest Ge'ez literature, because another thing that, maybe might be interesting for the readers, and maybe we'll get more into this, is that even though Christianity was the dominant faith in Ethiopia from the 4th century up until today, it still is, there was not a lot of original literature written in Ge'ez from the 4th up until like the 14th century. So for a very long time, there was not a lot of original Ge'ez literature. As I mentioned, the Bible and the most of the literature was translated from Coptic or Greek. And it really wasn't until the 14th century, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, because we talked about the story of the Queen of Sheba. And that's another reason why I have some doubts about that story, because, and others do as well, because one of the first books written in Ge'ez, original books, right, not a translation, was a book called the Keber Nagas, which means the glory of the kings. And that wasn't written until the 14th century. And that was when Ge'ez literature really started to get going. And as Ge'ez literature is starting to appear, and you have biographies of different saints like Tekla Hymenot, like Iyasus Moa, and others, you Stephanos, and then you have Gueorgius come along, the first documented author. These books are quoting the Bible, and including the Deuterocanon, and including Ezra Sutiel, and they are quoting it as if it's canon, and they don't tell us exactly when that happened. So it seems that these books were just being circulated and being used in churches and in Christian communities, and at some point they were embraced as canon. But yeah, we can't know exactly when that happened.
Let me get back to here. Let me say this regarding Second Esdras, just a point of clarification, and you could probably help me out with this. With Second Esdras, I noticed with the Syriac version that it only has chapters 3 to 14. It don't have chapter 1 and 2. It doesn't have chapters 15 and 16. The same thing with the Ethiopic, same thing with the Armenian, same thing with these different versions on the eastern side. So, with that being said, the Syriac version might be the primary version for all these other versions. Maybe. In scholarship, we don't talk with absolute. It makes a lot of sense. And the reason why it's important, because this version is saying Salathiel is the writer of Second Esdras and not Ezra the prophet, what it says in Ezra chapters 1 and 2, which is considered to be additions by the Christians in the 2nd century. And I think a lot of people, especially my brothers and sisters who hold to the BHI, the Black Hebrew Israelite doctrine, they worship this book, but they don't know where the book comes from. So with that being said, and we're talking about Ethiopia, and we're coming from an African-centered perspective, it's important to understand where the Ethiopian Ge'ez got this version from to put it in, because it's putting in the same version that the Syriacs have, Eastern Orthodox, the Armenians, and they don't have chapters 1 and 2, and they don't have chapters 15 and 16. So it's very important to understand. Second Esdras is one of the weirdest conversations anybody can have. And I just want to add that on to the that whole thing about Second Esdras.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly possible, and my scholarship has really focused more on the church history side of Ethiopia, more so than the biblical study side. So I haven't. So I would love to look more into it myself, and just to just to see. But I mean, I do know, as I'm sure you're aware, like most of the scholarly community, feel that it was originally written in Hebrew, especially being set in the, kind of during the Babylonian captivity. But as you said, now, and I'm not sure I'm it could be the case. I would, I'm not sure if more of it surviving it is necessarily means that it was originally written in Giz, just because, there's several books that only survive completely in Giz, like Enoch and Jubilees. But, they also, most Ethiopian and Eritreans don't even claim that they were originally written in Giz, but translated from Hebrew. And for whatever reason, they only survive in Giz. But I mean, you never know. It very well, it's a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even with the whole conversation about Hebrew, I was reading in the what is it, the Bible Biblical Encyclopedia, and they were saying that they have vacated that position as of it being written in Hebrew originally, and now saying it's Koine Greek because of what they call the Gracisms that they see, the Greek rooted stuff that they see. So we know that it's a Palestinian Jew based off of the narrative of 70 AD and a cross comparison with the temple falling in the first temple period, comparing it with 70 AD and the three kings of the Romans and the eagle, and so they know it's in the first century, but they know it's somebody Palestinian Jew that wrote it based off of the conversations that they're having and what they're writing in chapters 3 to 14. But in the first two chapters, which is not there, that's written 2nd century, and then you have 15 and 16, which is written 3rd century. So when you have church fathers quoting it, now you got to get into this now with Jerome with the Latin Vulgate. He puts it in the appendix and say, hey, this is a book that, I'll read it, but I'll put it in the appendix. I won't put it in the canon. But what version does Jerome have? Does he have the version with all 16 chapters? Or does he have the version with only 3 to 14? Or does he have the first two chapters? What does he have? So it's a very confusing study. That's what led to this interview, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Just to let you know, a question I asked my brother, because I'm trying to trace 2nd Esdras so I could do a whole show on it to make it clearer for my brothers and sisters who use that book. But it's a very tricky book, and as Damon Richardson said to me recently on a post, it's well, he used it what? It's an anaprophetic book. He tried to use the word anachronistic mixed with prophetic. He made up this word, and he's saying that although it's written anachronistically, it does have some prophecies in it that you can look and read, which is what some of the church fathers were saying, St. Ambrose and them, that it's not canon. I won't put it in the canon, but it got some stuff in there that we like, that we could use. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's what people should take from the book. It's literature. The bottom line, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, so we got like 6 or 7 more questions left. Let's moving forward with all these traditions before King Ezana. Do we find any literature? I said moving forward, and I'm taking you backwards. Moving forward with all these traditions before King Ezana, do we find any literature mentioning Queen of Sheba, Solomon, and Menelik refers before his time? So it goes between what you talked about, the 4th century to the 14th century with the Giz writings. This might be connected to that in a sense of what you said. Do we find writings before King Ezana time mentioning the Queen of Sheba tradition, the Solomon Menelik tradition before the King Ezana's time?
No, there isn't, and that's another reason why I would have some doubts as to the historicity of that tradition, because as I mentioned earlier, the text that is really the earliest that tells that story is the Keber Nagas, which means the glory of the kings. And that text was written probably in the 14th century. And it tells that whole story about Solomon and Queen of Sheba having Menelik and the Ark of the Covenant coming to Ethiopia. But again, and this actually might even relate to, again, not to go back to the Ezra Sutiel, but that would also, that should also be kept in mind when we think about when that book would have been translated into Ge'ez or many of the other books, because before King Ezana's time, there really wasn't a lot of Ge'ez literature. As we said, the Garima Gospels, the Bible were, and those books were like the Gospels and the New Testament Gospels. So there really wasn't, that would also make us, wonder, well, with Ezra Sutiel in the 1st century, would they have been able to were they, writing that in a full book in Ge'ez, especially if they didn't even have the New Testament books yet. When at that time, there's no Ge'ez book writing that we have evidence of at all. It's just inscriptions on coins or on stone tablets that are just kind of one page, and there's not full book length writing going on in Ethiopia, at least that we have evidence of. So that, so that's something we can keep in mind with regard to the idea of whether or not, Ezra Sutiel could have been original to Ge'ez. But yeah, because again, there were really no writing, even certainly in inscriptions, there was no writings or mention of the Queen of Sheba in that story. Certainly, she was mentioned in other Christian literature, but the story of Menelik and the Ark of the Covenant coming to Ethiopia, that doesn't come around until the 14th century, until much later.
Okay. All right, that was actually going to be my next question about Queen of Sheba, so we could skip that one and move on. So you have two writings that's mentioned in the cultural context of Ethiopia, the Feather Negas and the Kebra Negas. What's the difference between these two writings?
Yeah, so the Feather Negas is another really important text that in Ethiopia, as I mentioned, these are two of the earliest texts written. Or again, I should say, the Kebra Negas was the earliest original text that was original to Ge'ez. Whereas, and there's debates. We were talking about Ezra Sutiel, but actually there's debates about the Kebra Negas. Also, some people argue if it was original to Ge'ez or if it was a translation from Arabic or Coptic or something else. But so there's debates about the Kebra Negas. But the faith, and again, they're very different texts in terms of the nature of them, because the Kebra Negas is like it's like a legend. It's a story about how the Ark of the Covenant came to Ethiopia, and then it also ends with prophetic stories about the king of Ethiopia joining with the king of Rome and conquering southern Arabia. And that actually speaks to another really important point about Ethiopian history during the Axumite phase, because the Axumite phase of Ethiopian history would be from the 1st to the 10th century of the Common Era. And then the 10th century is about when the capital of Axum declined, and then Ethiopia, had new kingdoms and new dynasties that were reigning. But around the middle of the Axumite period in the 6th century, around the same time that the 9 saints came, actually there were briefly I could mention two important things about the history. Is number one was actually the creation of the Ethiopian liturgy. There was a saint named Yared who was also a monk, and he is credited with writing the first songs in the liturgy that's still used today, called the Degwa, Degwa, the Degwa music in Ethiopian history. But another event that happened was there was a king named Caleb who actually went to war against a Jewish kingdom in southern Arabia called the Himyarites, the kingdom of Himyar. And he actually went to war with them because they were massacring Christians, because this is in the 500s, so this is before Islam. And in Arabia, there were many Jews, there were many Christians, and there were many people who practiced polytheistic religion. And but the king of Himyar converted to Judaism and then began persecuting Christians and trying to force them to convert to Judaism. And so the Roman Emperor Justin asked King Caleb to go to war to protect them, and he did, and he actually conquered Himyar. And for that time, for some years in the 500s, southern Arabia was actually part of the kingdom of Axum. So that was actually the largest extent of the kingdom of Axumite history during that time. And so I just wanted to mention that. But all that to say that even despite the fact that the Axumites were literate, the fact that they clearly had a written language, and that they were a very prevalent kingdom, there wasn't a lot of literature that was being developed. And so during that whole period, there's no mention of the Queen of Sheba. There's no original literature really being written, but there's churches. In fact, a few years ago, there was a church named Beta Samati that just got discovered, and it was built during the 4th century. And so now it's considered the oldest church in sub-Saharan Africa that's known. So it was very, active society, but for some reason, it wasn't until the 14th century when Christians in Ethiopia really just started to desire to write more literature. And that's why earlier I mentioned with my new book, Gueorgius of Sagla is the earliest documented sub-Saharan African author, and people say, wow, that's really late, the 14th century. But that's because during the Axumite period, in Nubian history, there's no attested authors during this period, and in Ethiopian history, also it was just inscriptions in there or translated material, and there was no attested authors. And so the 14th century was really the beginning of a renaissance and really a golden era of Ethiopian literature and history. But that's why it's not till that time that we get that mention of the story. And so, to my knowledge, there's no mention of that story anytime during the Axumite period, like in the first millennium.
All right. Seeing that you're talking about churches and special churches, I want to give a shout out to Lalibela. You want to give a shout out to Lalibela as one of the greatest, probably structures, great wonders of the world. What you want to talk about? It's not in our questions, but you want to add on anything about Lalibela before we move on?
I relish the opportunities to give shout outs to Lalibela. This is, brothers and sisters, this is my favorite place on the entire planet right here. And I've been all around the world, and this is my absolute favorite place, most moving place I have ever been in my life. Not just Lalibela, but particularly St. Gueorgius Church, which we're showing right now, which is the most famous one. And if you look at the designs of the lines going around the building, and look at the horizontal lines and the windows and the shape of them, it looks like that stela. Remember the Axumites, the Ezana stela, and right. Many of the church, and actually there's other churches in Lalibela that show that influence even stronger. So again, it shows that these Christian churches, they were still drawing upon their pre-Christian African past, right? They weren't just completely rejecting it. A lot of people think Christianity came into Black people's lives and just whitewashed us and Europeanized us, but no, they drew upon their ancient Ethiopian past. All of those vertical and horizontal lines overlapping with each other in the layers, that's meant to evoke those Ezana and those stela from Axum. But basically, after the kingdom of Axum declined in the 10th century, the Axum was destroyed by a queen whose name was Judith. And there's not a lot known about Judith, but she's mentioned in a few sources as this. Some people say she was Jewish. Some people say she was Muslim. Some people say she was polytheistic. But whatever the case is, she destroyed Axum, and the kingdom of Axum declined. And also, after the rise of Islam, that also weakened the kingdom of Ethiopia, especially because the city of Adulis on the Red Sea was destroyed. We don't know how, but that lost a lot of their connection, and the Muslims took over the Red Sea trade. So, that's a big reason why Axum started to decline economically, and then it was, ended. But in the 12th century, a new kingdom emerged in a new dynasty emerged in Ethiopia, and they were called the Zagwe dynasty. So the Zagwe dynasty was centered in this city of Lalibela. And so this was not the Axumite kingdom, but this was a new dynasty, and it was a short-lived one. It was from the 12th to the 13th century, and the capital city was Lalibela. It was named after Geber Meskel Lalibela, who actually was, according to the tradition, was given a vision from God to build these churches. And these churches are amazing. They are the most amazing thing I've ever seen. As the picture shows us, they're not just buildings, but they're actually sculptures. Like that church you're looking at was carved into the ground. So that wall you see around it, that was them carving it into the ground, all out of one piece of rock. So they didn't add anything. There was no nailing or any kind of attachments. That is a sculpture, and it's a tall church building, and you can see shaped in the form of a cross. And it's an active church. People worship in that church every day. It's a pilgrimage site. On a holy feast day, you might see hundreds of Ethiopians all wearing white robes gathered all around that building, praying to it, bowing to it, kissing the building. And I love the building because it is a form of architecture that is unprecedented in the world. There's no architectural style like this in the world. It is unique to Ethiopia. It is a uniquely African structure. But I love, as a Christian, I'm biased, I love that it's a Christian church and that it's meant for worshiping Jesus. And it just shows the inseparability of Christian identity from Ethiopian and African identity. And there's about a dozen or so of these churches in Lalibela, and you can walk. They have tunnels connecting them, and it's just a really it's a beautiful city. If you ever have a chance, definitely go and go to Ethiopia, check it out. But Lalibela will be at the top of my list. And there's a dozen really beautiful ornate churches like that. But also even around the whole countryside, there are hundreds of rock churches. So it's not just in Lalibela. There are hundreds of rock churches all over Ethiopia and Eritrea, but those ones in Lalibela and that one in particular are the most famous, and they're just it's just amazing. It's the most beautiful, powerful place I've ever been.
Yeah, I just had to go there because I know I showed the Temple of Yeha, and I mean I could show all the churches you're talking about, but I just thought the Temple of Yeha and Lalibela. Lalibela is just an amazing site just to look at it, just see what they did as architecture, what Africans did. It's amazing. All right, so we in the Middle Ages right now. Before this time period, we have a gentleman by the name of Eldad the Danite. How influential was he regarding the tribe of Dan and Ethiopia tradition?
Yeah, that is a great question. You know, I have not yet come across any engagement with Eldad the Danite in Ethiopian tradition. It is certainly like, you know, Gueorgius that I just translated, or even other authors that I'm familiar with, like the you know, the biographies of Tekla Hymenot, or other folks, as Stephanos, and then even the writings of Zara Yacob or Walata Petros. I have not seen him mentioned. And from my understanding, where Eldad the Danite is from is a subject of, you know, a lot of confusion and debate. I've heard a lot of people say that he would have been from Southern Arabia. And, you know, just for the listeners, you know, Eldad the Danite was a Jewish author and traveler who lived in the late 9th century, and also left behind a book in Hebrew, the Sefer Eldad, or, you know, the book of Dad, and it mainly has lots of kind of Jewish rituals around eating rituals and prohibitions and things like that. And he was definitely known by Jewish scribes later in the Near East and in Europe. But I haven't seen a lot of Ethiopian scholars during the Middle Ages reference him. So that would kind of make, again, I'm not an expert in Eldad, but that would maybe, you know, the fact that I read Ethiopian, get his literature all the time, and I've never seen him mentioned, it makes me lean towards the idea that maybe he was not from Ethiopia. But he, in his book, he does say that he was from, quote, the other side of the river of Kush. So, like, what that means, it's like, what does that mean? Like, did he mean, like, you know, North Africa? Because he does talk about going to Kairouan, which is in modern Tunisia. There was a large Jewish community there, especially during the Middle Ages, the 9th, 10th century. I mean, we got to remember the 10th century was a Jewish golden era, especially in Andalusia or Al-Andalus, like in modern Spain, but not just there, but also the Umayyads, the Umayyad Muslims, they conquered Spain, North Africa, and there were Jewish travelers like Benjamin of Tudela and other people who were going all over Africa during this time. So, yeah, I mean, and then even like what people, I mean, this is an area I do actually work a lot in, is African cartography during the Middle Ages. And, you know, in Hebrew and Arabic literature during this time period, during Eldad's life, the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, people get things confused. Like sometimes somebody will be traveling on the Niger River and they'll be over in like Mali, but they'll call it the Nile, you know. And so, people in this time period, they will get geographically. So, yeah, he could have been from North Africa. Like I said, my understanding is that a lot of people have said that he was from Southern Arabia. But, you know, it's just, so I'm not really sure where he's from. And I think there's a lot of debate, but I haven't seen it mentioned, though.
Right. That I appreciate that. I think with Eldad, what I'm asking with the question is that there's a tradition today where Ethiopians, when they're connecting themselves to Israel, it claims to be from the Danites. And it actually, in my opinion, originated with him. And what happened is in that time period, there seems to be some sort of competition, for lack of a better term, between Jews and Christians. So him mentioning some lost tribes kind of sparked the whole Prester John tradition, because if you notice that writing, and you might the reason why you might not find it, because the tradition of Eldad the Danite is in the 12th century version of his writing and Prester John letters together. So the Christians put out the whole Prester John thing with Ethiopia, And the reason why, as you're speaking, it's coming to me while you're speaking to me with this wisdom, is that Ethiopia is traditionally more like a Christian nation with a mixture of Islam. So you wouldn't really find a Jewish tradition really in Ethiopia. You know, technically, you'd find a Christian tradition. That's why they said Prester John had the gold and it was in Ethiopia, because he's trying to say he's a Christian king. Hence the Portuguese reading about him later on, saying, hey, I got to go look for this Christian guy with the gold. And of course, they ran into West Africa, led to the slave trade and all that stuff. But that's why we probably won't hear about him from an Ethiopic perspective. But as far as the tradition now of the Beta Israel and the Falasha, they're connected, saying, hey, remember this guy Eldad the Danite said that Jews was here and the Israelites, lost tribes. There's a lost tribes movement, and then there's a Christian missionary movement, and both sides competing. That's how I look at it with the whole Prester John and reason why it wasn't in Ethiopia.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, because that is true. That is definitely true that there are many Beta Israel who specifically identify with the tribe of Dan. But at the same, I would be interested to learn more. I don't know if I would have a strong opinion on it, because at the same time, you have as we talked about, the tradition of Solomon, right? So, the House of Solomon, which even to the 1960s, Haile Selassie, and even still today, there's still the House of Solomon family is still in Ethiopia and then in the diaspora. And so they obviously would identify with the tribe of Judah, right? And then there are different Jewish communities. Now I will say there are people who, it's not just a Christian tradition. Like, there are people who are just Jewish, Ethiopians and Eritreans who are just Jewish. Like, they don't identify as Christians at all. And like you mentioned, the Beta Israel, the Falasha, other folks, and even in the Middle Ages, some of the texts that I have worked with, they mention those Falasha. In fact, especially like the victories of Amda-Sion, who was a Ethiopian emperor in the 14th century. He talks about some of his warfare. He was a Christian emperor of Ethiopia, and that's during the Solomonic dynasty, which is, we just talked about the Zagwe dynasty, but then when we get into the 13th century, that begins the Solomonic dynasty, and that's from 1275 until the 1960s. So that was the reigning dynasty in Ethiopia even until the 20th century. But even going back to the 14th century, in the beginning of the Solomonic dynasty, Amda-Sion, his chronicles talk about fighting with the Falashas and fighting with the Jewish communities, in the kind of western regions of northwestern regions of Ethiopia. And again, and then there's even mention of converts going back and forth, like which is really interesting. There, in some of this literature, there's mentions of people becoming Jewish who were Christian, or people becoming Christian who were Jewish. And so, so there's a lot of interchange going on. Now, I still haven't heard any mention of Eldad from that time. So, I don't know if, people who are in the modern world connecting to Eldad is more of a modern thing. Because but it could, I just may not have seen it yet, but very well could be there. But yeah, whether it was from Christian or Jewish sources in medieval Ethiopia, I haven't seen any mention of them though.
All right. Moving forward to colonial times, do we find Ethiopian traditions in West and Central Africa before or during the transatlantic slave trade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that's really kind of one of the main areas of scholarship that I'm really looking at now, because again, just with my own bias, because being a person of West African descent and also being a Nazari, a Christian, that's something that I've been interested in. And the interesting thing is that there is evidence of Christianity reaching West Africa, Central and West Africa, even before the transatlantic slave trade. One of the there's several examples, but my favorite one I love to share about is an Egyptian historian who, from the 14th century, early 14th century, so 100 years before the transatlantic slave trade started, mentions that he spoke with Mansa Musa, who was the king of Mali, and Mansa Musa mentioned that there was a whole Christian area in his Mali kingdom, which again, the Mali kingdom wasn't just the modern nation of Mali, but it was like Nigeria, parts of Burkina Faso, parts of Cameroon, northern Ghana, Benin, Togo, parts of Senegal. It encompassed a lot of West Africa. And so even 100 years before slavery, even, or I should say European slavery, that there was already Christians there. It came from, that's something that I'm working on right now in actually a project that I'm working on. And I can just summarize it to say that based on the evidence and connections I'm seeing, I'm leaning more in the direction of saying that I think it probably would have come from interaction, Christianity in Central or West Africa. I think it maybe would have come from interaction from Egypt or Nubia, more so than Ethiopia, just because of the amount of mentions of travelers and people connecting and merchants between Nubia in the Nubian capitals of Dongola and what's the other one? Soba in Alwa or Alodia, traveling between there and the Central and West African kingdoms of Cao and Ghana and Mali and Songhai. And then also Egypt as well, especially after Islam came into West Africa, and then many of the kingdoms like Mansa Musa himself, who went to Egypt on his way on the pilgrimage. So there was also a large pilgrimage from West Africa to the northern Maghreb or Mediterranean coast, and then going east into Egypt, into the Near East. So I think it would have been more likely from Egypt or Nubia. Now, there's definitely indications of Ethiopians connecting with other Africans in Central and West Africa. One example in the book The Golden Rhinoceros, which is a really great book that talks about medieval African history. There's a chapter on some of the tumuli or graves in Senegal. And there's even some ideas that maybe the nature of those graves could have been influenced by styles in Ethiopia, and especially because Ethiopian slaves were very common in the Islamic world. Having said that, going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, if you recall, again, what the word Ethiopian means, or in Arabic, what the word Sudan means, right? Sudan just means black. So they would get people and say, oh, those are Sudan people, right? Al-Sudan or Sudanese. Oftentimes it would be used in the same way that Greek people would use the term Ethiopian, right? Or Ethiopios. It just means black. So I'm not sure. So that's why I'm not sure about that necessarily. So I would say that as far as I can have seen, it does not seem like Ethiopian or Eritrean Christianity would have penetrated into Central West Africa, but it does seem that Egyptian and Nubian Christianity would have. But having said that, I will say that there is some indication that Ethiopian Christianity would have penetrated into maybe modern Somalia, or what was called Azania in ancient times. And then even there's an island called Socotra, which is right off the coast of Somalia and close to Yemen, that many different sources in late antique and Middle Ages said that it was full of Christians, actually. And that would have likely been through, connections with Ethiopia. And some of the, as I mentioned, some of the war chronicles that talk about Ethiopia's conquest during the 14th century under Amdasayom and Dawit I also mentioned them fighting with Islamic kingdoms, and at some points the Muslims winning, at other points the Christians winning, and with the Ifat and Adal sultanates. And so that also would have indicated some contact with what's now Somalia, and then even going out into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean.
Okay, beautiful, well said. All right, we got, I think, 2 more questions. Do you have, in the 1800s, we do see strong movements within the African-American communities or the Black communities here in Americas, referred to as Ethiopian movements, referred as Ethiopianism. Folks quoting the Bible beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, and I think they're quoting Psalm 68:31, etc. Can you talk about the importance of this movement, Ethiopianism?
Yeah, that's a great question. That I would even maybe even consider myself part of that movement. As an African American Christian Nazari, who even the fact that I like to use Ethiopian words to frame my Christian identity as a Nazari, believing in the Bisrat, the gospel, or engaging in hymenode, right? Or theology, another his word. But yeah, and actually the interesting thing is, as far as my understanding, I think Ethiopianism as a movement, actually, even before people in Jamaica or African Americans, my understanding is that even in the 1800s, it actually started in South Africa, or maybe could have been contemporaneous, but yeah, actually, my understanding is that and it actually relates to my own personal story as an African American Nazari, as a Christian who trying to move away from these Eurocentric expressions of Christianity, that in the history of South Africa, that there were many English and Dutch missionaries, and many of the Christians in South Africa were under, and this is across the board in many parts of Africa where there's Christianity, that many of the Christian denominations were under like Anglican or Baptist or Presbyterian or European or North American denominations, and they were experiencing racism and experiencing paternalism, where the white American or European churches would not allow them to be self-governing, and they felt that they were not being dignified as being able to lead their own churches. And so many, starting in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, you had a whole movement, and this is still going on across the continent of Africa. You had a whole movement of what's called African Initiated Churches, or AICs. And then as the 20th century went on, you had groups like the Zion Christian Church in South Africa, or the Aladura Church in Nigeria, or the Kimbangu Church in Uganda, and there's all these different movements across the continent of trying to break away from the white American or European denominations that they felt were being paternalistic towards them, and some of them drew upon Ethiopia as a symbolic identity of them being Black African Christians for other Black Christians throughout the diaspora, to draw upon as an idea. As you said, Psalm 68, Ethiopia will stretch her hands out. Again, in the Hebrew, it said Cush, but that we already talked about that. And also the fact that Ethiopia was this ancient Christian church, African church, that was not, it was Christian before most of Europe was Christian. So they have and as we've talked about, have a rich tradition that is completely different and in so many ways, architecturally, liturgically, artistically, aesthetically, theologically, very distinct from European Christianity. Again, and many people in Africana studies have said rightly that Ethiopian, and I would add Eritrean Christianity, are indigenous African religions. And so many people started to move away from that and draw upon Ethiopia as an inspiration. And of course, this became a very big source of inspiration in the mid 20th century for Jamaicans, especially in the Rastafari movement, and then even Marcus Garvey as well. Many Pan-Africanists would look to Ethiopia, again, as I mentioned, the only Black country to never have been colonized. And this would have been very popular in the mid 1900s, 20th century, when many African nations were becoming independent, and especially in 1960, the year of Africa. And so Ethiopia was looked at as this symbol of Black freedom, never having been colonized. And again, especially for Christians, who finding a church that is independent and uniquely African ran, and certainly in African American communities as well. Ethiopianism is very, I would even say that I'm a part of that in a way. I would call myself an Ethiopianist in the sense of seeing Ethiopia as a very important source for all people, and especially for Black people, and especially for Black Christians to draw upon as an inspiration. Obviously, understanding our own unique cultural dynamic here or wherever we find ourselves. But yeah, that's my understanding of Ethiopianism.
And a lot of seeing that I was born in Jamaica, a lot of Rastafarians get mad when I talk about Rastafarianism originating in America. And the reason why I said that, even with the most popular Rastafarian movement, which is Leonard Howell, he gave homage to the folks who put the Pibi Bible together and gave homage to them and the Ethiopian movement. A lot of Rastafarians don't realize that that's what influenced even Garvey before he even came here. We know Booker T influenced him, but as far as holding to Ethiopia and trying to have this African, pro-African before Pan-Africanism was fully established, it comes out of the Ethiopianism movement here in the United States, which you see influence in South Africa. You talked about the churches with an African-centered perspective as far as their Christianity. And even in Jamaica, you see it with Paul Bogle, Sam Sharp, all these Christian preachers who are using Ethiopia and those same verses in Psalm 68 and talking about, hey, how we need to talk about Africa first and revive Africa, and we're all from Africa and so forth. So it was all about pride, and that's what the Rastafari movement is about. But the last question I have for you, and I'm going to show 2 books while you're talking. I'm going to show the book that Eric Mason had you write a chapter in, Restoring of the Christian Identity, and your current book. I'm going to show it on the screen. And I'm going to put a link. When I put this video out, I'm going to put a link so people can pre-order it or order it, depending on when I put the video out, and give you some support, because you put in the work. I got to say, I have a real life scholar right here who is represented from the African American community, who is an Ethiopianist, as he does declare, and a Nazari. And shout out to your fellow Nazari, Dr. Eric Mason, who's a brilliant brother. I can't wait to interview him too. And people who are understanding restoring the Christianity back to where it needs to be in the African American community. Not because everybody turn around and say, hey, I'm a Christian, but what it meant to be a Christian and add scholarship to it. These brothers are putting in the work. All right. So last question, and we out of here. Can you talk about the Nazrawi from an African-centered position from the 1st century and how you have revived this tradition today? Everybody gonna love that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I definitely I appreciate that. That is a huge part of my scholarship, but also my ministry. As you mentioned, even just wanting to understand more of Gueorgius of Sagla. Again, I mean, he's important for world history, but especially for Black people of African descent. He's one of the he's the first documented sub-Saharan author. But especially for those of us that are Nazrawis. And so again, Gueorgius, he uses this word Nazrawi in the Ge'ez, and it's a word that means Christian. Christian is a term that has been used from the beginning of Christianity. In Greek, it just means one of Christ. But Nazrawi is also a term that's used as a Nazarene, right? Someone who follows Jesus of Nazareth. And this was a term that was used more commonly in the eastern part of the world, in Syria and in Persia and in Ethiopia. And so it's not that I necessarily have anything against the word Christian, but it's a way of distancing ourselves, because I love, we were talking about some of these 19th century leaders like, Booker T. And I love Frederick Douglass's quote, right, where he says that between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, talking about slaveholding America, he said, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide, in fact, that to be a friend of one means to be the enemy of the other. So I say today, just as I say that I'm an Ethiopianist and I'm Black and proud, and I'm proud to be of African descent, and I'm a Christian, I'm a Nazrawi. I also say that I am an enemy to the racist expression of Christianity that we are seeing being played out in this country right now, literally at this moment. That we see people who are supporting racist policies that are going on all throughout this country and this world right now from a current racist administration. And so I say proudly, this is just Vince speaking, that I am against the expressions of Christianity that are supporting things that are going on, that I am not a part of that, that we are a part of a whole different religion. I am not a part, that is not my faith. And so that's another way. It's one way of saying that as a Nazrawi, that I am a part of the faith of Booker T, of Frederick Douglass, of Phyllis Wheatley, of Harriet Tubman, the spirit that guided her to lead our ancestors to freedom. That's the spirit, and the abolitionists that supported them and that worked with them. And so that's really what's meant by saying Nazrawi, and really, and even as the Urban Apologetics book and community, and there are many Nazrawis, Christians that are, followers of Jesus of Nazareth, who are reclaiming our African identity, because so often what was given was a European, Eurocentric expression of Christianity. But the beautiful thing is that nonetheless, people like Frederick Douglass, even growing up in slavery, he still understood that what these people are doing and what they're passing off as Christianity is actually not. And that's why I say today, 200 years later, these people's descendants are still perverting Christianity and using it toward their own oppressive ends. But even Frederick Douglass understood that that's not real Christianity. That's not the Christianity of Jesus. That's not the Christianity of Yeshua, the Messiah. And so that's what he understood even 200 years ago in the midst of slavery. And so that's what we're trying to do, is that as we are rejecting the whitewashed expression of Christianity or the Europeanized version of Christianity, we're not rejecting Christianity as a whole, because we understand that's not real Christianity anyway. But we're getting back to the Christianity of Christ, which we know is for all people. It's for every nation, tribe, and tongue. And at the same time, Black people in particular have been oppressed and have been attacked and traumatized in very unique ways. And so that's why it is for myself and many of the other folks in the Black Nazarawi community, it's important for us not to say that anybody's better than anybody else, but to specifically uplift Black history, African history, and African traditions and identity, and authors like Gueorgius, and to not only so that we as Black Christians, Nazarawis, can draw upon this and really reconnect. I mean, remember the Akan concept of Sankofa, right? Is go back and get. It's not taboo to go back and take that which has been lost. And so we, in so many ways, were cut off in the diaspora from our ancestry. And so we need to go back and connect and reconnect with a lot of those traditions that were taken. But yet, even still, a lot of the traditions survive. I'm as a Pan-Africanist, an Ethiopianist, I'm a big proponent of arguing that I don't believe that all African culture was lost on the boats on the way over here. I firmly believe that when you go into a Black church and when you see the movements and you hear the percussion and when you hear the preaching, that I believe that there is a lot of African in that, in our cooking and our music and everything. And so I don't think it was all lost. That's a whole debate in sociological, anthropological circles. Like, are African Americans actually African at all? I'm on the side of that, say absolutely. Of course, it's a new Creole identity, just like same for Jamaicans, Haitians, Afro-Brazilians, and all that. But I would argue we still have a lot of that. And I think, but we have to go back and reconnect with even more of that. And especially those of us who are Black and Nazarawi, when we see the beautiful traditions in Ethiopia, Egypt, Nubia, and we see the fact that from the 1st century to the 15th century, most Africans were Christians, at least the ones that left writings for us, like Gueorgius and Shenouda and Pachomius and Zara Yaakov. And I mean, most of them were Christians, and they weren't forced to be Christian. Nobody enslaved them. Nobody imposed Christianity. They became Christian. They became Nazarawi of their own free will and built these magnificent churches. When you go look at ancient Nubia from this time period, ancient Egypt, ancient Ethiopia, Eritrea, North Africa, and Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, you're going to mainly see churches. And so this is if you love being Black and you are proud to be Black and proud of being of African descent, then you have to, celebrate the Christian, the Nazarawi tradition that gave us so much literature and art. I mean, that actually on the cover of my book is actually an actual depiction of Gueorgius of Sagla. It's actually housed in the Met Museum in New York, and that's actually from another one of the books that he wrote. So that's a 15th century depiction of Gueorgius. So and so again, it just shows how important it is for all of us to really go back and reconnect. But as a Nazarawi myself, I find it really inspiring for my faith as a Christian to know that I don't have to choose between being a Christian, believing in Jesus, and being a person of African descent and being Black and proud. That those two things are not in tension with each other, but rather they completely go together. And again, that Church of Lalibela that you showed illustrates that beautifully, because you can't separate that is a uniquely African structure and that it's a uniquely Christian structure. The two are inseparable. And that's really, Ethiopia has shown that, I would say, probably almost better than any other Black culture in the world. And so that's really where they are an inspiration to me, and I think to all people.
Oh man, hey, listen, bro. I can't even tell you thank you enough for this interview. This is beautiful. We're right at the 2-hour mark. I might have to chop it into 2, but this is beautiful, man. I'm gonna definitely do a clip of the whole Ethiopian translation and what it means and so forth. I got a clip and probably put it out tomorrow. But the whole interview, I haven't decided when I'm going to do it yet. But I want to say thank you. I'm gonna put you in I'm gonna close out the video and we could conversate a little bit after we're done. But I want to say you did a great job. You taught me a lot within these 2 hours. You probably taught a whole college series in this interview about Ethiopia. I could chop this up into a series, man. Beautiful and well done. You are definitely an apple in the eye of African Americans for being a scholar that represents them first and foremost. And as far as representing Africa, as far as being an Ethiopianist, I'm definitely proud of you for that, man. Shout out to you for that. All right. Peace and love, family. Thanks for tuning in.